Just realized I didn't have my mic on. Let me start over. This is the first episode of the Hidden History podcast, or the Hidden History series, if you will. And it is going to cover everything from ancient history going all the way up through the modern era and and a lot of things in between. The focus of this is going to be on topics or deep dives on topics that don't get a lot of coverage in mainstream historical narratives. For example, this first topic we're covering is going to be Atlantis. Atlantis is typically seen as something that is fringe, something that is not something that you hear of covered in a history book. It may just be a footnote, but it's one of the earlier things that I found on this document or this diagram that I discovered online that covers everything going all the way back, ancient history, all the way up through the modern era, the Trump era. This is going to cover a lot of those things that you might have questions about, I have questions about, but you don't really hear about. You'd have to go do personal research to cover and to find out about. So I'm going to go do that personal research, and you get the chance to listen in on my thoughts and my discoveries on the stuff that I find through this. So by no means am I an expert on these topics. By no means am I someone who you should trust on these topics, other than the fact that I will do my homework. So if you trust that, then that's just the disclaimer on this. It's going to be entertaining at worst, and hopefully, and some conspiratorial, or possibly some conspiratorial nonsense at worst, I should say. But entertaining, hopefully, and informative, and giving you a little more insight into some of this stuff. So we are streaming live right now. We should be live on 3 different platforms, and make sure that is live. We are on YouTube, Periscope, and Twitch right now under the channel of MORPHITE or MORPHITE Online, so you can find us there. And otherwise, we will be adding more platforms as we're able, and see what else we can do with that. So the first topic we've got going on is Atlantis, as I mentioned. And very first of all, I wanted to go into Plato himself, since he's the progenitor of this concept of Atlantis. The earliest documentation we have of this concept of Atlantis has to do with Plato. Turn that down just slightly. All right. So, Plato. Who was Plato? What was he about? What did he do? Plato was a philosopher during the 5th century. So he was born roughly between 428, 427 BC before Christ. So that would be, what's it now, 2020, so that would be 2,440 years ago, somewhere in there, is when he was born. And what's interesting about his life, as I started looking him up a little bit, is, of course, the things that he did in his life, but that he came of age, the time and period in which he was alive was what was known as the Peloponnesian War. So the Peloponnesian War was a war between the 2 leading city-states that were in charge of Greece, Athens, and Sparta at that time. And so you see Sparta mainly attacking on Athens during the time when he was alive. And the reason I bring that up is because there was a lot of naval warfare going on, and obviously a time of turmoil, and a time when you saw established norms, established governments being overturned or combated, and things, that whole idea of things being overthrown and all of that. And I believe it would be impossible for that not to affect his life, not to affect the things he wrote about and the things he covered throughout his life as a philosopher. Of course, most people know him as a philosopher. Plato was one of the earlier philosophers. It's interesting when we look back through history and we think of people who are great thinkers, people who are great documentarians, historians, etc. Really, the only reason we know them, we know about them, we think they're so great, is because they wrote everything down. They recorded everything. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to do series like this, like the Bible Verses series, even the Saturday morning, fun time Saturday stream that I do. I wanted to be able to record for myself, for posterity, for others, so we know who we are as MORPHITE, who I am, and that is actually recorded and put out there in the world somewhere. Unless you record it, that's the old internet adage, right? Pictures or it didn't happen. You have to have something recorded somewhere, or else all you have is hearsay. All you have is someone telling their own opinion. Now, in the case of people like Plato and philosophers and historians from way back when, all we have is their writings, and so we would have to verify between their writings and other historical documents to see, was this actually something that happened, or was it an opinion, or was this just a flight of fancy on their part? And more often than not, we would just have to chalk it up to, we don't know. We can't know, because all we have is what they wrote, and we have no way of verifying it otherwise outside of that. So, back to Plato. He was a student of Socrates, as Mr. Mack taught us back in my political history class in high school. It was the acronym SPA is the easiest way to remember that. There was Socrates, Plato, then Aristotle. Socrates, of course, was a person who upset the norms a lot. In fact, he was judged for that very much so by his society. He came up with this idea of Socratic method, a lot of the philosophical concepts of questioning things, of answering question with a question, and really just getting people, his students, to think about things on a deeper level, to think about things more. So after that fact, Plato then, after learning from this man and after growing up in this way of thinking, his biggest contributions would be philosophical. He talked a lot about ethics, cosmology, metaphysics, a lot of different things. His biggest thing that he came up with, though, or what people might remember him the best for, would be this idea of metaphysics or metaphysical theory. This is this idea of a distinction. Platonism talks about this distinction between the world of the senses, the everyday real life, and the unseen world of true realities, which can be the object of the intellect. So he talked a lot about this idea of forms, this idea that every object is an object, but it's also a representation of the concept of that object. It is a manifestation of its own symbol, if that makes sense. If I have a water bottle, it is a water bottle. It is also a symbol of a water bottle, and it is a symbol to anyone who sees it of what a water bottle is and what it looks like. If that makes sense. That's really the simplest way you can kind of communicate that is using an example of an actual object. Of course, then that brings about a lot of other concepts within it, this idea that there's a lot more going on than meets the eye, the idea that there are universal truths, and et cetera, et cetera. Of course, most everything that the philosophers of that age had or that they referenced was not biblical philosophy, it was Greek philosophy. There are some overlap in some of the concepts, but probably won't go a ton into biblical concepts with him there. Let's see, what else? Do we have anything else? He talked a lot about science, mathematical knowledge, all of these things. Mathematics, as he saw it, offered certain truth, although not about the familiar world. So again, a lot of what he talked about, a lot of what he studied and thought about was things that did not actually manifest or exist in reality, but the concepts behind the reality. And the reason I'm going into this so much and kind of reinforcing this concept is because when we study the idea of Atlantis, when we study the idea of the things that he wrote about, this is the overarching theme, meta-theme over all of his writings. Now, he would talk about literal history and those kind of things throughout his writings. However, he spent most of his time talking about and thinking about this idea of philosophy, these things that were not real in the sense that, as another teacher of mine said, you wouldn't be able to pour ketchup on them. All right, so back to Plato and his life. He was alive, of course, as we mentioned, born around 428, 427 BC. He lived throughout the Peloponnesian War. His family, it's interesting, too, in talking about his background and talking about this concept of reality versus non-reality. Of course, Greek life was built up a lot around this concept of the Greek gods. You had Zeus, you had all of that going on. You had Poseidon, who was the god of the sea, which is really interesting because on his father's side of the family, they claim to be descendants of Poseidon. Now, there is belief that Poseidon was a real person, was a real, I believe, a political leader of some sort, and that the legends and the myths of the god Poseidon, little g god, was based on this real man, this real person. And there's definite possibility with a lot of the old gods of the old worlds that they were based upon real people, because those were the legends that they would tell to the children. Of course, everyone embellishes when they're talking about how great grandpa was, and as that gets passed down, of course, he just gets more and more magnificent, and pretty soon everyone's like, well, he must have been, beyond human. So this is kind of the thought about several of these figures, that they may have been based at some point on real people, but then when you incorporate in tales and myths that are surrounding other people and other things, and you kind of get this amalgamation, that eventually you end up with what we know now as the Greek gods. But it's interesting because when you think about your own history, your own parents, your own lineage, and thinking back to, hey, this side of the family, I can't trace that line back to more humans, I trace it back to what people would consider to be a god. It gives you a different perspective of yourself, a different perspective of your family, a different perspective of your place in the natural world. So again, those things had to have had some impact on Plato himself and in his philosophy and in his thinking. He did not have any children. It's assumed that he was never actually married. We don't have any reference that he was married. He did have some siblings. and his father died when he was very young. His mother remarried with her uncle after a time. So that's if you want to know about his family life a little bit. He didn't really have much of his own family life to speak of. Let's see what else we got here. Interesting is that in one of the passages about Atlantis that we see, he mentions Critias. Critias is actually who he names it after, one of the ones that we'll get into. Critias is one of the people in this dialogue. These passages where we see Atlantis are these dialogues that he wrote, and again, we don't really know that these were dialogues that actually happened, or if he's paraphrasing conversations that really happened, or if he's making them up out of whole cloth. We don't really have a way of knowing or verifying that. However, Critias was a relative of his, and this is interesting as well because Critias was the one who led this group called the 30 Tyrants in 404 BC. So at that time, young Plato would have been roughly 20 years old, and it was an oligarchy that ruled Athens after the Peloponnesian War. And these 30 tyrants, they were commissioners who were appointed to the oligarchy, and they had an extremist group. Critias was one of the leaders. He was actually uncle to Plato, so they had conversations, of course, about politics and war and government and all these things a lot. But this particular group had a very, very bloody history. They killed roughly 1,500 people that we know of. Many people fled the city. They gathered a force, and they came back to defeat them. In 403, there was another battle, and then those 30 men fled off after that period. They were killed out over the next few years. So you can see that there was a lot of things going and coming within Plato's life, I would assume if I lived in the middle of a time of war, in the middle of a time of when relatives are involved in these kind of activities, I don't even know if my parents on my father's side, if they're actually real people. You can see where he was constantly searching for truth. He was constantly searching for foundational ideas and foundational concepts, and constantly trying to see beyond what was right in front of him to say what's the greater purpose, what's the greater cause for these things. So of course he joined up with Socrates. Socrates didn't actually have any writing that we have found. So everything that we know about him was written about him, not from him himself. After he learned from Socrates, after Socrates died, Plato probably was traveling throughout Greece, Italy, Egypt, learning. He seems to have been influenced by Pythagoras and his theories. And so that's roughly as much as we need to know, I think, about Plato himself to do with those things. Let me see if there's anything else I had here. Everything, of course, was written in ancient Greek, so the things that we have of writings of Plato would be our translations into English. Therefore, as with any translation, there's going to be a little bit of discussion over whether certain terms should be rendered a certain way or not. However, the gist of everything that is there is fairly accurate from everything that I've seen. The two pieces that I will be referencing with the writings about Atlantis are pulled from the MIT.edu website, where they have classics posted, and they were translated by Benjamin Jowett. They appear to have been written in 360 BC, which, of course, if he was born in, 428, then he would have been... well, that's when they were discovered, I should say, because he appears to have died in 348. So, which would means he would have lived 100 years, maybe. Back then, they didn't have the census. They didn't have all these things, at least to the level of the records that we have now. So these are kind of just the estimated time periods that we have. This translation is based on documents that were written in 360 BC, according to what we know. There's a lot of leeway with a lot of these dates. They could be 20, 30, 40, maybe even 50 years forward or backward, depending on what we found and where we found it in translations. So don't hang me on those. I want to read, though, a little passage here before we run out of time that is actually an introduction to this idea of Atlantis. So let me pull that up here. And Timaeus is going to be the... Timaeus talks about the creation of the world by... It is one of his writings. It's a dialogue, as I mentioned earlier. It concerns creation of the world by what's called a demiurge, which is kind of like a god-type figure, operates on forms in space, and after he's created them, then these lesser gods help him continue to form them. Earth, air, fire, and water are looked at as consisting of two kinds of triangles, which combine into different characteristic solids. I don't want to read the entire thing or go into all of the philosophy of it, since we're mainly talking about Atlantis. But again, I did want to give some background, some context, some framing as we talk about the idea of Atlantis. Plato, in this work in particular, Timaeus, talks about mathematical harmonics that produce then a cosmology. So again, the thought behind the reality. Critias is the then sequel to Timaeus, and then the content of that is the story of the War of Athens and Atlantis. So we'll talk about that a little bit, probably in the next episode. But I want to read this passage from Timaeus, which was the first writing that first mentions Atlantis. Many great and wonderful deeds are recorded of your state in our histories, but one of them exceeds all the rest in greatness and valor. For these histories tell of a mighty power which unprovoked made an expedition against the whole of Europe and Asia, and to which your city put an end. This power came forth out of the Atlantic Ocean, for in those days the Atlantic was navigable, and there was an island situated in front of the straits, by which are by you called the Pillars of Heracles. The island was larger than Libya and Asia put together, and was the way to other islands, and from these you might pass to the whole of the opposite continent which surrounded the true ocean, for this sea which is within the Straits of Heracles is only a harbor, having a narrow entrance, but that other is a real sea, and the surrounding land may be most truly called a boundless continent. Now in this island of Atlantis there was a great and powerful empire which had rule over the whole island and several others, and over parts of the continent, and furthermore the men of Atlantis had subjected the parts of Libya within the columns of Heracles as far as Egypt, and of Europe as far as Tyrrhenia. This vast power, gathered into one, endeavored to subdue at a blow our country and yours, and the whole of the region within the straits. And then Solon, your country, shone forth, in the excellence of her virtue and strength among all mankind. She was preeminent in courage and military skill, and was the leader of the Hellenes. And when the rest fell off from her, being compelled to stand alone, after having undergone the very extremity of danger, she defeated and triumphed over the invaders, and preserved from slavery those who were not yet subjugated, and generously liberated all the rest of us who dwell within the pillars. But afterwards there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared into the depths of the sea. For which reason the sea in those parts is impassable and impenetrable, because there is a shoal of mud in the way, and this was caused by the subsidence of the island. This is part of these dialogues. This is Critias speaking in this dialogue to Solon and Timaeus, and of course talking about Atlantis, and that is the first glimpse we see of the concept of Atlantis and what occurred. So what he talks about, of course, is this invasion, this battle that's occurring. Atlantis seems to win this battle, but then afterwards there's earthquakes and floods, and Atlantis is put under the ocean for all of time. The word Atlantis comes from the god Atlas, who, contrary to popular belief, did not hold up the earth, but actually held up the sky. And Atlantis means of Atlas. So there's this idea that there's constantly these discussions among, which god was in charge of what. Of course, Poseidon was in charge of the ocean, so Atlantis would be but under his care, or under someone who is in charge of that. So the term Atlantis, then, some people have thought to believe, as it appears earlier than this. There's actually writings where the word Atlantis appears. However, that particular term and use of that term is not referring to this island of Atlantis as Plato speaks of it, but is referring to something that is of the god Atlas. So that's why we are not going to be referencing that at all, because from everything I looked at, it does not. I forget who was doing the writing, but it didn't have anything to do with this concept of Atlantis. It was a completely different story about something else that was not related at all, simply using that term Atlantis to refer to something of Atlas. So that's about all we want to cover today. This, of course, is our very first episode. We're just talking a little bit about Plato, who he was, his ideas, and then we'll go into next time some more stuff about Atlantis. If you like this series, if you want to see more about this, you want to see more of this, please subscribe to this video on whatever platform, like it, share it. Let me know in the comments if you have something, a correction. If you know your history better than I do, please correct me. Please let me know, and we'll definitely pop that in there as an update, or on the next episode we'll fill that out. And that is our first episode where we're talking about Plato, we're talking about Atlantis. We'll have the next episode on Thursday, and it will be on Thursday evenings. I probably won't have a set time because of things that happen during the day, work schedule, etc. But yeah, that will be the first episode. And appreciate you all for joining me, and we'll see you next time.